Hi, everybody. This is the February meeting of the Monterey Bay chapter of the California Rare Fruit Growers. I'm Carol Golsch, and I'm leading the session this evening with the wonderful help of our long-term member, Freddy Menge, who is a well-known orchardist in our area. I'm sure many of our local group have met Freddy before, but for folks who are joining us from other chapters, Freddy is a terrific participant in our group, provides many scions, leads trainings, offers advice, and is generally a joy for everyone to work with. I hope Ellen, his wife, agrees with that. So we're going to start out now with watching a video that Freddy and Ellen put together. We're going to try to take questions during the video as things go. But, you know, if you think of something and we don't answer the question, don't worry, we'll be taking more questions at the end. And without more ado, Freddy, if you want to click on share screen, we'll get started.
Okay, so this is going to be our introduction to grafting video, and just to talk about grafting a little bit, it's a pretty simple concept. It's the matching of the cambium layers of two compatible pieces of wood and effectively sealing it up so that the two can grow together. There's many kinds of grafting. There's side grafting, chip bud grafting, shiplap, whip graft, whip and tongue. Today we're going to demonstrate the simple cleft graft. So first thing before we do much demonstrating of that, we're going to talk about the knife. Okay, the knife is a single beveled. It's beveled on this side, absolutely flat on this side, and the profile of that knife is identical to a chisel. So it's flat on one side, bevel on the other, so that when it rides over the surface of the wood, it bites into the grain and cuts through it, instead of acting like a ski over the top of the blade and shaving off the bark. And if you have your knife upside down, you end up whittling. It's not effective. It's hard to make it work. So there's right-handed knives and there's left-handed knives. Make sure you get one that works for you, so that, and you know it works for you when the flat side of the blade is toward the wood and the bevel side is up. And then, okay, so the next step is, let's talk about how do you hold the knife. You know, holding the knife is pretty crucial. There's a lot of videos out there. There's people doing this. I used to teach grafting workshops where I taught people to graft like this, to cut the wood like that. And that's, you can do it. It's possible. It's very difficult. You'll never be as good a grafter if you graft like this than if you graft like this. The ideal way. Hands in front of you, knife blade facing you, the bud you're going to select to cut below facing you. Hold your hands like this. Caveman. Slice one way, flip it over, slice it another way. So you see what I've got here is a tapered cut. It's wider at the top, thinner at the bottom, but it's also thicker in the front and skinnier in the back. So that way, when it goes into my cleft, it meets here on the outside where the cambium layer is. And we talk about cambium layer. And cambium layer is really simple. It's the part of the wood that's right in between the xylem, the wood part, and the bark part. So it's actually the living, growing layer of cells right in between the two. It's not the outer bark, it's not the bark itself, it's the layer between the inner bark and the wood. And so I've got this thing cut. Let's do another one. That was just pretty quick. I'm gonna do another one. I got the caveman grip. I've got the blade facing me, my bud facing me, turn my arms like this, kind of using my body as a center, as an anvil kind of to work against. And I just, with both hands, or even keep the knife stationary. If you can keep the knife stationary and just pull the wood through, you can get a very clean, straight cut. And it's important to not wiggle that knife around. The problem with this kind of cutting, with this whittling style, is it's very difficult to not have scooping cuts and bumpy surfaces. It's impossible, virtually, to make a single cut effectively all the way through. Whereas with the caveman style, it's pretty much, you know, it sets you up to do it with one cut all the way through. You get a perfectly flat face. So pretend this stick here has roots on the other end of it, or it's a branch on the end of it, you know, on the end of a tree that you want to graft off. You cut cleanly across the top with one of these things, and then I'm going to make another cleft, another wedge. And I should speak to a few issues here. You want to be kind of quick. This is an instructional video and we're covering a lot of things. We're not being especially quick here, so I'm letting this dry out. But when you're in the actual process of grafting, you want to mess around as little as possible between the time you cut these faces and you insert them into your cleft. So here's making the cleft. I'm taking the knife, set that in the very top of the end of my stick, and I rock it gently. Use light pressure and rock it. And every time you rock it, it bites down on one edge, and it kind of slowly drops down. Oops. And that's what can happen. That's why you don't want to have your hands underneath. That's, you know, that's no good. That messes up the whole thing. But if I'd had my hands down here doing that, that would have cut right into me at that time. Try again. Sometimes it's hard to cut it straight. So there's a straight. I cut down 2 inches or so, give myself enough room so I can slide this wedge in there. So there's the wedge just set in place. I've got a bud right here, and that bud is going to want to grow, so I'm going to pick the bud out right now and make sure I tape over that so that it doesn't lose moisture. Okay, but in the just normal course of this graft, I'm securing the bottom of that split so that it doesn't run, so it doesn't keep going, and then I can put the rest of the pressure that I need to put on this thing, on this scion, and I can use my hand to feel if the stock and the scion are roughly the same size. The bark will be roughly the same thickness, and you can often just feel on the outside whether they match up fairly neatly. Sometimes if you're using a very big stock and a small scion, you have to use your eyes and really be careful. You have to look to where the interface between the xylem and the phlegm, between the bark and the wood occurs. It'll be a much thicker piece of bark it'll be very thick bark on a thicker branch and thin bark on a thin branch, and you have to line up the interface between the cambium line of both. And so that's just that, you know, that interface between the bark and the wood. And you have to make sure those match, because that's the only part of the branch that's actually growing. The rest of the tree is just basically circulation or irrigation tubing. So here we go. This is a pretty nice match. It's all set up. It's down there, pushed in tight. The bud down here is down inside the cleft. I like to do that. I'm not sure it's crucial to do that, but when you have this bud down in here, there's a lot of carbohydrate and a lot of nutrition in this area here, and a lot of action. So there's faster healing that occurs in this area than in, say, this area. So I like that inside. It's nice. Not super crucial. Maybe it makes a small percentage, you know, a better growth. Okay, so as I stretch my masking tape onto this graft. I'm waterproofing and I'm tensioning at the same time. Okay, so I've got that bud. Now, okay, so there we go. I put the bud down inside the cleft, but that means I have to tape over it. Is that a bad thing? No, not really. I've got another bud right here, if you can see it on the other side of the camera. And that bud under there will be fine. It might pop out as well, but since I had that change in diameter, the tape is a little bit bunchy and wrinkled, and that's something you have to watch for. Using this method is probably I'm using common masking tape. Now, masking tape, it's not, it's not grafting tape. It's not, strictly speaking, the thing you're supposed to use. A lot of people use different materials. They use parafilm. They use horticultural tape. They use an asphalt mastic, electrical tape. Those all have their pluses and minuses. This is very cheap. It's available. It works as well as anything, and I like it. I like it because it sloughs off by itself. You don't have to go back later and cut it loose like you do with some of the materials that people use. If you don't cut electrical tape loose, it can girdle. You can basically put a stricture or tourniquet around the growth of the branch and it'll break off after a while. So this one, masking tape breaks down on its own. You don't have to do anything about it. You just graft it and you go. So, but in order to have masking tape work, you have to be very diligent about this top edge and make sure this is baggage and wrinkle free. If there's any wrinkles or kinks or puckers in it, it'll take in water. So I've got a bud there. That's great. I'm going to cut it off 3/4 of an inch or so. Not too close to this bud here. You cut it down to 1/4 inch and then you're wrapping right into the bud, and it's awkward. So it doesn't matter how far above you go. You can leave 2 buds on, you can leave 3 buds on, you can leave 1 bud on, whatever. I've got a bud in here that probably will pop through the masking tape, and I've got a bud here. There's plenty. You leave too many buds on, and you end up, some people will say, oh, I want 9 buds on there so it'll make branches. Well, when you leave too many buds on, leave a lot of buds on, you basically divide the amount of push you have to any individual buds, and you reduce that the energy going into any single bud. So the fewer buds, the better, really. But if you leave just 1 bud, you run the risk of something coming along and knocking it off, like a Phoebe might land on the top here and break that off. So, do whatever you want to do. But okay, so what I've done here is I wrap this into a cylinder, push the tape together, and it's a completely waterproof cap that will break down in a year. This thing will just continue to grow. It's set to go. You don't have to shade it or anything for a deciduous graft like an apple tree or a pear tree or a plum. The buds that occur down below the graft will want to push, and in your sort of aftercare, you should be aware of that, and you should be suppressing these buds. Like if this is a baby tree, it's a new rootstock that you just grafted, you don't want to kill these buds because you need something to nurture the really minimal roots they give you on those little rootstocks. So it's a good idea to let them come out and pinch them a little bit. Just keep them below the graft section of your tree. Keep them small until this part takes off. Once this is a foot or so long, you can remove those branches at the bottom, or if you can, stay on it, just keep them small. They won't do any harm. Once they get close to the same height as the graft itself, as the bud that you want to grow, then you run the risk of them dominating and overtaking it, and they'll suppress the growth of this one in favor of the growth of the sucker you don't want.
Let's go ahead and take some questions. Freddie, there was a little bit of chat in the chat interface regarding the use of masking tape, and I wondered if you might just elaborate a little bit more about the use of masking tape versus parafilm versus buddy tape, and what you perceive as the advantages and disadvantages of each.
Yeah, okay, so masking tape, it's almost the perfect material. It's kind of an organic material. It's made of paper, so it dissolves at about the right speed. Parafilm, you need to wrap parafilm with something additional that, you know, in addition to the parafilm itself. You need another product. You need a rubber band for tension, or, you know, or masking tape with parafilm. That's also possible, but parafilm holding the tension on a cleft graft in hot weather, when you get a heat wave above 85 degrees or 80 degrees, it'll soften the parafilm to the point where it'll break down on the sunny side, and so you can have easy graft failures. Plus, it's expensive, and it's a little bit of a barrier to entry because you have to order it online, and you know, it's not always on hand. So this masking tape is about less than $3 a roll at Home Depot, and it's just good enough as far as, like I say, it doesn't constrict. You don't have to cut it off. Sharon has a complaint about it, that it actually looks a little bit unsightly. You know, that you can clearly see where your grafts are. You can see this year's graft because the masking tape is brighter. Last year's graft, it's starting to disappear. 2 years, maybe 3 years max, it goes away. But for, you know, you can kind of use it as a carbon dating system to see whether it was this year's graft or last year's graft. And I don't know if it's necessarily a disadvantage, but you know, it is a fact that it doesn't look great. So
Patricia Evans is asking a follow-on question. Does blue painter's tape work as well as masking tape?
It works. It doesn't adhere quite as well. Blue painter's tape is made to pull off. So in certain conditions, I've seen it unravel in rain. You get rainy weather on blue painter's tape, it can unravel. And also the blue color is less light reflective, so it heats up more, and that can be a problem. You can actually get, you know, too hot under the graft, and so I've used it. You can use it, but I don't think it's as good.
And a question from me, Freddie, is there any need to try to take these various types of tape off, like in the fall? Or do you know, like you can leave masking tape, but you have to take off the parafilm, or any, you know, guidance around that? Like, for example, to avoid girdling the graft and so on.
Yeah, I don't think parafilm is nice in that way. I don't think you need to take parafilm off. I think it generally breaks down over the summer. And you can take the masking tape off. You can peel it off usually pretty easily by late summer, but there's no necessity to. You don't jeopardize the tree.
This is clearly an area where we all need more guidance, because we've got yet another exciting question. This one is from Irene. Hello, Irene. Irene is asking, do you still need to put a rubber band over the masking tape?
No, you don't want to put a rubber band over the masking tape. There's no need to. Unless you feel like you haven't got very good tension on your cinching your cleft together. If you feel like you're not getting good pressure with the masking tape, if it's not working for you, use a rubber band. Yeah, that can give you additional tension. And then rubber bands usually break down eventually, usually.
Looks like our next question has to do with the timing of grafting. And I think that's a topic that came up in our group recently on the email trail. And that is, you know, what's the best time to graft different fruits? Like, you know, persimmons maybe are later in the season than apples, perhaps, right? But any guidance around that?
Yeah, apples and pears are pretty unfinicky. You can graft them during the dormant season. You can graft them into the growth season. It doesn't matter too much. If you're grafting in a place where you're in danger of getting real hard freezes, it's better to graft later so that your newly calloused the wound callus, when the graft starts to knit, it forms callus tissue, and that can freeze and fail. So if you're in a really cold area, it makes sense to graft a little warmer a little bit later. So the later you graft, the warmer it is. Peaches, apricots, plums, it's kind of unfortunate. Better to graft those later, although they break out in bloom much earlier than the apples and pears. So you've got a little bit of a dilemma. You should, you'd get better percentages take if you waited, except that your cyanwood can start growing in the refrigerator and you might lose it completely. So yeah, so hope for nice weather. Persimmons, again, persimmons, you want to wait for the actual stock tree or rootstock that you're grafting onto. You want to wait for it to break bud and push half-inch leaves. You want the leaves to be unfolding and expanding a half an inch, so it's actually in growth. You don't want to graft the stalk of this persimmon fully dormant. The cyanwood should be fully dormant, but the stalk can't be.
So it's really not necessarily a question of what month so much as it is what weather, right? And the state of your tree. Is that a fair summary?
Mm-hmm. You bet. I mean, maybe there are climates where you can, make a pretty good approximation for calendar timing, but here, forget it. You have to look at the weather and, you wait for warmer weather for, if you can, wait for as late as you can with your apricot, plum, and peach, cherry,
Mm-hmm. So if you're grafting onto a apricot, plum, or peach tree and it's starting to bloom, is it too late?
No, great, no problem.
Okay, so it's just if the scion is starting to push buds that you're running a risk.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, we have another question here from Irene. She's asking, if you were grafting over a seedling, do you need to remove all the lower leaves and buds? In other words, so you've got some below where you've made the cut, there's some growth there.
Yeah, you need to control all that growth. All the growth below the graft should be kept submissive to the graft. It should be not allowed to, I talk about in the video, it shouldn't be allowed to grow much. It's a good idea to keep a little bit, let it pop out, pinch the tip, keep it below the graft, and then you're fine. Once the graft starts growing, you can get rid of that, but you don't really want to get rid of the seedling or small rootstock growth, because you can kill your rootstock by, having it pop leaves, and then it's used energy to pop those new leaves. If you strip them off, there's no payback. The roots are kind of impoverished, and they, they're more susceptible to death.
So then would you consider in the second year after grafting that you might take those stems off completely?
If you don't, you'll have problems. Yeah. If you're trying to, if you want your graft to grow, then you better control the growth from the original stock.
I don't know if other people on the call took advantage at the Scion Exchange of the interstem project that we got started with, but we were distributing plum rootstock and Adara. Am I saying that right, Freddie? Adara interstems.
Yeah.
So I was wondering myself, since I got a pair, if you wanted to graft those two together and then graft something, of course, on top of the interstem, do you do it all at once, or do you wait until after the interstem has sort of shown some liveliness? What are the rules around that?
Yeah, it's a little bit troublesome, because you're dealing with plum or cherry or peach wood, which breaks out early. I mean, it would be great if you could graft the Adara to the rootstock, have that take off and start growing, and then, and then graft your dormant apricot wood or whatever cherry wood onto the Adara in the single season. Might work great. your timing is usually a little bit of a problem with that, because the Adara will be not leafing out or whatever, not starting to grow before your apricot will already start to take off. So what you can do, what I've done, is graft the Adara to the apricot or the cherry first, just bench graft it inside and put it in a plastic bag so it holds its moisture. So the two scions of the rootstock and of the scion and the inner stem are connected and healing up and wrapped, just cleft graft, wrap them together, put them in a plastic bag with a piece of damp paper or something, and let them callus at room temperature for a little while until you notice that the buds start to grow, and that will start that healing process of that graft. Then you can take that unit later on in the season and put it onto your rootstock. And I've had that work and I've had that fail, but I imagine.
Well, that's the
And then I've done it.
experimentation part.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you do it better than others, but it certainly works to do it over 2 years and grow. That Adara grows like a weed. You graft it onto a rootstock, it'll grow huge. You chop it back, and anything you put on it will grow pretty well. Great
to know. Curious, did that, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say, it's really vigorous. It grows really strong, but it's also got supposed to have a higher fruiting efficiency than Myro or Citation or some of the cherry rootstocks. So it's supposed to be more size controlling once it starts to set fruit. It's got high fruiting efficiency. It fruits more heavily than the standard plum rootstock or cherry rootstock by itself.
Well, this is
so it counteracts some of the vigor. The vigor is a little bit scary sometimes. It's like, whoa, that thing is going to take off. But but once it starts making fruit, the actual productivity of that rootstock underneath any scion will control the size of that scion, so it won't get nuts out of hand.
Great. It sounds like we have a couple other folks on the call who are also doing some of this interstem grafting. Patricia Evans says that she usually grafts the Adara 1 year and then the target cultivar the next year. And John Valenzuela is sharing that the Adara is also called puente. Puente means bridge in Spanish, so that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, that it's used that way? I think there was like one more. Oh, and Patricia notes that puente is a patented name, and so we're not supposed to trade puente, so call it Adara if you're trading it, I guess.
That's great, thanks.
Yes. Yeah, let's see, we're still getting people curious with the whole masking tape question. Jing is asking, if you're bud grafting, will the bud grow out of the masking tape? I guess grow through it. Is that right, Jing?
I use parafilm usually when I bud graft, but yeah, it will. I usually, I mean, when you wrap with masking tape a cleft graft and you wrap a bud with a single layer of masking tape, that bud will break through it. So a cleft, unless you triple it up, I mean, sorry, a bud graft, unless you triple up the masking tape over the top. If you triple up the masking tape 3 layers, you can suppress that bud perfectly. But I imagine you could slit it with a razor or a knife right over the bud. But yeah, I don't know. She's got to do some experimenting and give us a presentation.
Let's see, Molly is asking, when is the best time to graft avocados?
After April 1st, the first good flush of growth, and the stalk should be in vigor. It should be really growing.
And Brett Graff, what a great name for this discussion, graft. Okay. You've never heard that before, right, Brett? Is asking for a persimmon scion. is it best to store it in the fridge in a bag or to wrap it in paraffin?
Better to put it in a bag with, you know, with something damp.
Okay. Yes,
I did.
all right. Let's see. Have I hit everybody's questions that have come up so far? I'm just kind of scanning our list here to see if I missed anything.
Should we be typing our questions or can we unmute and ask them?
Go ahead and unmute. I'm game for that. Saves me from talking.
Perfect.
So I was wondering, and thanks Freddy for sharing all this, but I was wondering when you cut the graft, does it matter where on the node you cut it, or if you do it between the nodes, like do you graft between nodes, or I saw you kind of sliced one node a little bit. Does it matter?
Yeah, you're talking about the position of the, whether I'm trying to make my cleft in the internode section or around the bud itself. Is that the question?
Yeah, I think, because I think that the stalk you do it above the node, but then on the scion, do you also do it between the nodes, or do you intentionally like slice the node a little bit?
You know, it doesn't make that much difference. Like if you wrap everything up, anything will work. There is a school of thought that says that that bud itself, you know, is more heavily provisioned with carbohydrates, has more growth energy, more healing energy, will callus better than the internodal section. So, you know, if you try to get that bud, get a bud down in your cleft, theoretically, it heals faster. You might get more growth out of it. Check it out. I don't know. You know, it's hard to tell. Some grafts grow, some grafts are slow, and it's hard to make a connection, really. So, but that's the theory.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
John Valenzuela is asking, I think, a terrific question that I myself have meant to ask. Any tips on using a scion that is larger than the rootstock? And maybe the opposite question. What if you have a scion that's much tinier than the rootstock?
It's usually the case that you have a scion that's smaller than the rootstock. That's pretty typical. But it looks a little weird sometimes when you have you know, a giant scion and a skinny little rootstock. And I think the rules in both cases are the same. You line up the cambium layers on one side and one side only, and that big scion that you're sticking in the little teeny stalk, you just let the other end hang off and taper the bottom so it's not, you know, so it's not hanging off square, you know, make it so that it flares up, you know, and the bigger the scion, the better, you know, the bigger the scion you put on, the more it's going to grow probably. There's some relationship to the growth of next year, you know, next year's growth is predicated by what happened last year on that stick. There's a physiological sort of programming. So if you use a tiny, tiny little scion that grew very little last year, you can expect maybe an improvement this year if you give it a big rootstock to push it, but you'll always get bigger growth, better growth with a thicker scion. So maybe that's too much information.
No, I liked it. John, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
John said
John's
yes.
just being nice.
John said yes. Okay. I've seen some stuff online, Freddie, about, you know, if the scion is quite tiny, you know, like less than half the size of the rootstock, of putting two pieces of scion next to each other inside the cleft. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great fan of having two. I mean, there's a benefit of putting two pieces of cyanwood in a single cleft where you get that the wound healing from both sides, and theoretically it could heal twice as fast. but one of the problems of putting two scions in a single cleft is that you'll end up with a hollow open pocket between the two. And it's a place where water can collect and where you can have fungal or bacterial damage. You can get a rot situation. So I kind of like to leave one side of that graft open and just, if I'm working with a really big, if I'm top working a tree and I've got a 4-inch cut and I've got 1/2 inch or 1/3 of an inch scions, I'll line up my scions. I'll make either clefts or rind grafts, 2 or 3 or 4 from 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, and 3 o'clock on that face of that big 4-inch cut. And I'll leave the bottom open. So the bottom doesn't have a scion. So it doesn't create a stopper or a dam or a little pool where where that scab or that branch will cup a little bit of water and make that branch rot more than it otherwise would.
Okay. Let's see, Roger. Hello, Roger. Roger is asking if it's necessary to cut off the top of the scion wood and seal it with masking tape, or can it be left as it is? And Roger, do you mean like if it was the end of the branch and it had some, a node at the top, or do you mean if it's already been cut by the person who was preparing the scion?
No, I'm just noticing Freddie's video, which thank you for doing that, Freddie. He cut the top of it off and then he put masking tape over it. I'm just wondering if that's necessary, if you can just leave it cut the way it came.
Yeah, well, I mean, you certainly, if you have a branch, if your scion has a bud at the end of it that hasn't been cut, it's not usually the case. Normally, you're cutting your scion from the bottom end of a 1-inch growth on the thicker end, and you have to cut it. And so, if you cut it, then you got to seal it. But if you have a really thick triploid apple or something, and it gets nice and thick all the way to the end, you can leave that end uncut. That tip, that bud in there, it will be a nice vegetative bud most of the time and grow really well. So certainly don't have to cut it.
Yeah, that's useful, but what I'm thinking of is we get the scion wood and it's cut on both ends typically.
Yeah.
You take the one end and you make a wedge out of it and you do your cleft graft.
Right.
The other end is already cut. Do you need to cut that even more and then put masking tape on it? That's what I thought I saw you do in the video.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't do that and you'll have pretty low percentages. You have to cut, you have to at least rewrap that other end. And you certainly, usually, like I spoke to the point of, you don't want to leave 5 or 6 or 7 buds on there because you deplete, you divide the push, but so.
That's interesting because I've never done that before. I've just left it the way it is and it seems to have worked pretty well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
forgiving.
So do you not wrap the end of your graft? You just leave that open?
I just leave it open, yeah.
Yeah, I've had people do that. That's interesting that it works. It's not supposed to.
less work, I guess I'm lazy.
Well, yeah, but you're not getting as much growth on your grafts as you probably should be because you must be leaving a lot of buds on there. And so, if you were to cut it down to 2 buds or 1 bud and let 1 bud grow, you'd get 4 or 5 feet extension on a good graft, and then you could actually be training that as it comes out by nipping the terminal leaves without harming the terminal tip, and it would stimulate branching and spurring as it moves out. So you'd end up with a beautiful kind of feathered scion, or basically a sapling coming off of your graft.
Good point. I'll start cutting the ends off.
Yeah, it's worth it. It's worth it. It's not hard.
So I'm going to jump ahead a couple questions. I haven't forgotten anybody, but I'm going to jump ahead to a question from Irene because it's kind of on the same topic. when you wrap the scion with masking tape, can you just not wrap the buds? Like, I guess, go past them, right, Irene?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like on the on the signwood bud, can you just skip over the bud so that it is so that it can be exposed?
Are you talking about bud grafting with masking tape, or are you talking about what do you what
Well,
kind of-
I mean, like when you're using your masking tape
yeah.
to wrap your signwood like you did on a demonstration, can you just wrap the cut end and the exposed top end and just not wrap it around the bud?
Well, there's no reason to wrap it around the bud. You're only really wrapping around your wound, your graft itself. And in the process of wrapping tightly around your graft all the way up over the shoulder of the stalk and onto the scion, you have to wrap over the bud that's down in that cleft if there is a bud down there, or the buds that are on the stalk. So yeah, you have to wrap those, but there's no reason to go up beyond, much beyond the shoulder of the stalk. You don't have to, there's no reason to wrap the scion all the way up and skip the buds. You shouldn't really be doing that. It's too much work, I think.
Oh, I got one more question now. On your masking tape, do you do it just once around, or do you have to put 2 layers at the bottom portion of the wound?
Yeah, at the bottom, it's nice to do it to do 2 wraps, 2 or 3 wraps around the bottom, and then you can force the wedge your scion into the cleft really tightly with a lot of pressure, and you can get excellent compression in that graft. Otherwise, it is a little bit difficult, to pull the masking tape hard enough to just produce that kind of tension without wrapping it 2 or 3 times around at the very bottom of the graft.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All righty, we're going to go back to Brett now. He's asking about grafting knives and how are they different from a pocket knife?
Yeah, a pocket knife is beveled on 2 sides. And so when you lay that beveled edge along, when you try to cut through wood with a beveled edge down against the wood, it skates along the surface of the wood, and it's great for peeling the wood, but it doesn't effectively slice through the grains to the grain of the wood to produce a clean grafting cut. So you can have a really, really sharp pocket knife, excellent blade, surgically sharp blade, but that bevel will always make that cut kind of flatten out and have a peeling aspect to it. And if you're a master knifesman, you can probably still produce a graft, but it'll never be easy with that tool. It's the wrong tool. And that applies to utility knives. A lot of people use those box cutters, and it's the same thing. Those are two beveled knives, then they tend to skate along the surface or along the grains. They're actually pretty good box cutters or a very sharp pocket knife. They split the stock pretty nicely because they have an even bevel. They don't go sideways. The grafting knife has one bevel, and it tends to do what I did in my video, which is slice off the side unless you're careful. So.
Okay, yeah, I've never actually seen a grafting knife. So if you don't have one with you, you're better off just using your Felcos or something that have because those are one-sided, sharpened on one side.
Yeah, but they're not sharp enough. Even I don't think you can get your Felcos sharp enough. They're really got a clumsy, thick blade compared to a properly tuned grafting knife should be like a scalpel. It's a really sharp thing, should take very little effort to cut through the wood. And for me, I grind my knife, I grind it slightly hollow, just very slightly convex on the flat side. And I grind my bevel with a fine stone, and then I use like a rouge, a green buffing rouge to polish it out. So I actually have a polished cutting surface that you can test by trying to slice into the back of your thumbnail. And if you slide that blade along the back of your thumbnail, the cutting edge of your blade, it should bite immediately, very easily. And that's, you're kind of like diagnostic. If it's biting well, then your knife's working well. But you need to get a grafting knife if you're going to do a lot of grafting. You do a little bit of grafting, you use a box cutter, that's fine. But you know, you get a good grafting knife, well tuned, it makes it a joy. It's easy.
Let's see, Freddie, our next question is from, I think it's Rita. Will a scion onto the lowest branches on an espalier survive?
That really depends on whether it could, you know, so how much vigor is the tree got? Is it got enough vigor to push that scion? Because I think what she's alluding to is the grafts put in near the top of the tree are going to be, the branches near the top of the tree are favored. They're going to grow more, and the ones at the bottom are a little bit less. But certainly, you know, if your espalier is in good vigor, and you should be able to graft onto the bottom of the tree.
Okay. And I just want to jump back now to one point from John Valenzuela. He's asking if you could talk a little bit about the difference between left-handed and right-handed grafting knives while we're on the subject of grafting knives.
Yeah, okay, well, you know, since lefties and righties are basically doing the opposite things, the bevels on the left-handed and right-handed knives are on opposite sides. And so the trick, you know, to looking, and I guess it's complicated too, because if you're using the whittling technique where you're holding the knife in front and pushing the blade away from you, then if you're a right-hander, you need to be using a left-handed knife. A right-handed grafting knife will be upside down if you're using it in the whittling technique that I was kind of mocking at the beginning of my video. You know, if you're the right-handed grafting knife or left-handed grafting knife, they're manufactured really with the caveman style that I demonstrate in mind. So it's important. And basically that bevel has to be pointed away from the wood. The flat side of that knife has to lay down against the wood when you're holding your knife to your scion.
See, Karen is asking, when the host is much larger than the scion, how do you seal the larger branch?
Yeah, so you've got this big stalk that you split open. It's often a problem. So I encounter that a lot. A lot of times if I have something like that, I'll take my chainsaw or sharp saw and cut it, and absolutely immediately, I mean, I'll put my saw down and pick up my Doc Farwell's and paint that surface. I'm talking about a 4 or 6 or 8 inch stock that I've cut, the giant cut that I encounter that a lot of times grafting avocado trees. You cut an avocado tree, sometimes you're grafting on a 9-inch face that's cut at an angle. And so you cut that thing down, immediately you pick up your Doc Farwell's. You don't let any more airborne bacteria fall on that cut than you possibly can help. You waterproof that thing, and then you let it dry. You let it cure, and it takes 20 minutes to half an hour. And so a lot of times that'll be my first step. I'll go through a bunch of trees where I'm doing major cuts that I want to graft into. I'll make all those cuts one at a time, dock Farwell them up one at a time, seal them up, and then after, I'm done, I'll go back to the beginning, and one at a time I'll graft them. So maybe I'll split that big stalk with my big grafting hatchet and a screwdriver, and I'll put a scion in there, and then I'll take something like plumber's putty or toilet bowls, toilet sealing wax. There's the wax rings that carpenters or plumbers set a toilet onto the pipe in your bathroom. It's kind of a pretty hard wax, and you can buy those rings for about $4 at Home Depot and use that wax and smear that in that cleft that's wide open that would otherwise suck in a bunch of water and cause rot danger. So yeah, I use that. Is that good?
Yeah, I think that was a good explanation. And if you had something similar to that I've encountered, Freddie, is when you have a branch on a tree, like with my older trees, I'm not trying to climb up ladders. I just want to graft a little bit onto these, branches that are this big, but the scion is a fraction of that. Would you still seal it with the dock Farwell after you'd made the cleft?
Well, anything like smaller than an inch in the stalk, smaller than an inch, or a little over an inch. I use masking tape, and I just seal over it with a masking tape.
Okay, great.
Yeah, just wrap it as if it's a rootstock, and that seems to work fine.
Okay. Jing is asking if the scion wood was the top part of the branch, and the scion top does not have an open cut. Do I still need to cut the scion top off and wrap it?
Nope. No, it's fine. Use that top bud. It grows. It tends to really do what it's supposed to do.
We need to change our instructions for cutting scions, huh? Leave the top graft on.
Yeah.
Let's see.
You don't always get that top bud, but
John is commenting a little bit more about the left-handed grafting knives, that the left-handed ones can be hard to find. John, any comments about where you have found them? Is this like something you can find on Amazon, or is it a specialty shop that sells left-handed grafting knives?
I'm right-handed, so it's not an issue for me personally,
Mm-hmm.
but I do have a friend who's left-handed, and he has found left-handed bevel ones for, like, we're doing this pulling, caveman style pulling across each other, across your chest. He has to either buy a knife that costs $10, maybe 50% or 25% more because it's ground differently, or he has to get it reground himself. And you can do that. You can take a knife, and your blade's going to be more narrow when you're done, but you can regrind them to have a bevel on the opposite side. So for him, it's a dilemma. And so I'm just kind of letting all the lefties know out there that there is this issue. I will mention, though, also, what is that French folding knife that everybody has?
Opinel.
Opinel. That one, even though it's technically a double bevel, it's such a shallow, it's less than 20%. It's like 15%, but it's very curved. There's not like an absolute edge to the bevel. It like curves back to the flat part of the knife. And I found that one to be sometimes easy to use for lefties or righties. So I just had to mention that. But
yeah. I mean, it seems like the Opinel, if it's double beveled, but it's got a really shallow, whatever bevel rake or whatever, it's just as good for a lefty as a righty.
Yeah.
It's not as good as a well-tuned. I mean, Opinels are such nice blades, but it's unfortunate that you can't get a true grafting grind on an Opinel thin, beautiful Opinel blade.
Yeah, my friend, like you're saying with polishing those edges, we have a friend who's a retired machinist up here in Redwood Empire chapter, Eugene, and he takes his blades from 15 down to about 10, or from 20 down to 15, or sometimes even narrower. But then you have to be careful because, especially in hardwood, you know, you can bend it or whatever. It needs more care to keep it that thin. But my God, when you're working through the wood, it's like such a difference to have a thinner, you know, bite into it. It's amazing.
Right.
So these are all little fine details for folks who are new to this, but the difference between, you know, getting by with a snap razor or blade, or, you know, disposable razor or something, compared to an actual knife that's sharpened really well, is revolutionary, and your grafts will be happier.
Yeah. I mean, and speaking to availability of left-handed and right-handed knives, I'm a lefty, and I know that the Victorinox, the Swiss Army brand, makes a pretty good basic knife that's around $20, $20 to $30 or something, and that's cheap, and it's a hard stainless steel blade that keeps an edge pretty well. It's a very good knife. You can
Left or right?
You can buy left or right. Yeah, you can go to
Same price.
Leonard. I don't know. You know, mostly, yeah, pretty much. But you know, you can buy a German Tina knife for $120. But you know,
That's what I think. My friend's really into tools, so he was like up there in that range, and that's where they were charging more money for the other way. So
Sure.
I'll have to convince him, just, you know, spend $20 and do a nice, you know, Swiss, the Victorinox ones are fine.
Or yeah, you know, if you're capable of regrinding your blade or sharpening a dull blade, eBay is a good idea. I love old grafting knives, and I've found beautiful old knives from the 20s, British steel, left-handed, and bought them, and I bought left-handed ones and sharpened them, and that's what I use today. I've also bought a right-hander and converted it to a left-hander by grinding the bevel off of it and creating a new bevel on the other side of the blade, and that works pretty well. But I really like my, you know, my bone handled knife from the 20s that I got for like $15 on eBay. So.
Sharon had a couple things she wanted to say. Sharon,
Sweet.
are you there?
Yes. Let me make sure I'm unmuted. Okay, can you hear me?
Sound great.
Okay, so I tried buying grafting knives on Amazon just for the kick to see if I could get some additional knives, and I'm still back down to my Swiss Army grafting knife and one from Antonio, because many of the knives that claim to be grafting knife, and sometimes they even claim to be single beveled grafting knife, turn out to be either double beveled or have a kind of just a tiny bevel on the flat side, so it's really not true single bevel.
Yep.
So those just ended up being wasted money. Some knives will say they'll give you two blade, one is this way and the other is the other way. They all turn out to be junk. So that's one experience.
I am so glad you said that. We've had the same experience with the, you know, previous years of the CRFG. We've purchased a load of single bevel grafting knives, and only to find exactly what you say. Every single knife had to be ground, you know, extensively to grind that second tiny bevel that basically destroyed the functionality of that knife. So
Yes.
Yeah, be careful buying grafting knives. Victorinox is a pretty good one, but you know, that's the best cheap grafting knife that I would recommend.
Yeah. So the other thing, I just want to put it out there. A few months ago, I was just doing some research on the Geneva rootstock, and I was looking on their website, and I saw this recommendation that I've never heard people mention, which is they say, due to the way the rootstocks are, the Geneva rootstocks are cloned, when you get it, you should not keep the soil level at the same level. You should bury it by 4 more inches.
Really?
Okay, it's on Geneva website.
Wow.
I guess because those 4 inches will grow more roots. And then when you graft, you know, you should do your graft based on the new soil level, not the original level that the rootstock came.
That's
Has it,
incredible. I didn't
anybody notice this?
Wait,
know. No, I didn't notice that.
Can
Huh.
you say that second part again, Sharon? When you go to graft
Oh.
it, you should do what?
You like if you want to have 6 inches of rootstock,
Mhm.
you should make the cut 6 inches from the new soil level, which is supposed to be 4
Oh,
inches
Right,
above.
right, where
the
it was
old soil
originally.
level.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know whether like M111 has this or not, but I just noticed. So I started putting more soil in my already potted apple saplings.
Yeah, I think that's pretty easy to do. If I've got all my Genevas already in the ground, but I can go back and kick a bunch of, nice potting soil or compost up over the top, add
Yeah.
4 inches basically to my mound. And I know,
Right. And
but that's
yeah.
great to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
and I'm also liking to make my grafts a little bit higher, because I found from experience that maybe as a beginner, when I didn't firm the planting hole enough, so if I had just planted the graft union 4 inches above the level, the tree ended up sinking
Hmm.
as the soil settled. So with one tree, for a while, I didn't notice, or I didn't know this was serious. The graft union got below the soil level. And so the scion started growing a bunch of roots too. And
Right.
so the one tree, I planted triplets, but the one tree that this happened with grew to be huge, like 3 times the size of the others. So I'm wondering if the scion starts to send out roots, that'll bypass the dwarfing function of the rootstock.
Right.
And you might end up with a really big tree. Fortunately, I caught it enough soon enough, so I got rid of all the roots from the scion, and seemed like after I did that, and I made and I pulled some soil away from the graft union. After I did that, that particular tree was not nearly as vigorous as before, which is good.
That makes sense though.
Okay, let's see. Our next question is from Brett, and he's wondering about various folks' opinions about grafting tools. So I can share that I have a Victorinox and I like it. I don't have anything to compare it to, but it fits nicely in my hand. It's super sharp. I'm terribly clumsy, so my husband made me a guard for the hand that holds the rootstock. And the guard is a metal plate for a light switch. I guess you could use a plastic one, but mine happens to be metal, and you just stick the rootstock through the hole where the switch would go, and then you can hold underneath that piece of metal and you can cut with a lot more confidence. So the sharpness is great if you're clever with a knife, and if you're a goof with a sharp thing like I am, then having a little tool to guard your hand is a nice thing. And my husband made this out of a light switch plate. So that's my comment on grafting tools. Is anybody else using something other than Victorinox, or have other comments about Victorinox that you'd like to unmute yourself and share? Oh, John is saying the CD. Yes, you can put the rootstock through this hole in the CD. That's very clever. Or a roll
Yes.
of tape. Yeah.
I also have an Italian brand. I think it's called Antonio, and it's an actual grafting knife with wooden handle. What I found is that wooden handle, if it gets damp, the wood expands and it becomes nearly impossible for me to close it. So I still go back to my Victorinox all the time because it just works in every way.
Yeah, Sharon, I bought a Tina one time. It was $110, and it was a very nice knife. It was small, very sharp. I had to work on the blade a little bit when I got it. It had a little double bevel. It wasn't perfect, but it had a walnut handle. It was very nice.
Ah.
But once it hit the ground in my orchard where there's all the wood chips, it is almost impossible to see. And I was running across my orchard sometime and I got to where I was grafting and my knife wasn't in my pocket anymore. It must have jiggled out and it fell somewhere on the way, and I spent several hours tracing my steps and I never found that knife again. And I will never, buy a wood handled knife, again, just because you can lose it so easy. Anyway.
So, the one that I was showing you, this is one that I actually bought
Let's
like
see,
a
Brett,
while ago.
let me make you add spotlight. There we go. Now we can see you. Okay.
So I got this one. This is like less than $20 on eBay, and it's not very, like, it's not the art of grafting, like where you're trying to cut it to fit perfectly. It's more like a tool. Like you can see, it has these little shapes.
Yeah.
And it kind of pre-cuts the wood like that.
Yeah.
And this is my first year grafting, so I got this and I tried it on my figs, and it seems like it's working, but I don't know, is it like a gimmick or like a cheater's tool or?
It's a little bit of it's a little bit of a gimmick. It's not very versatile. It can make a nice cut. It can work, but those little patterns, those blades will dull after 10 or 15 grafts, and it's virtually impossible to sharpen them. And they're not at all flexible in, different size scion versus different. It's a very unusual situation when you have perfect match of your stock and your scion. You almost, you don't really want to be grafting onto really skinny stalks, because even though most of the time your scion wood is on the skinny side. So it encourages, a tool like that encourages you to go way out on the far branches to get the skinny branches so that you can find something that matches your scion. And then you end up with a graft that's hanging way off the center of your tree, and then 2 years from now it's like, oh my god, I should have cut that branch off, but I've got a graft on it, so I can't cut it now. It kind of encourages bad horticultural practices, but it certainly can work. I don't like those things too much.
Freddie, you're an artist, right?
Well, I just think those things limit the number of situations where you can actually make an effective graft. But they're pretty good for if you have a bunch of 3/8 inch rootstocks and you've got a whole bunch of 3/8 inch scion wood and you want to put them together, you can go chunk and put them together. And that machine works pretty well for that until it's dull. Okay, but anyway.
I agree with Freddie. I got the same thing that Brent got, that tool, but I don't like it that much. So I actually have this pruner that I use. I don't use a knife. I use a pruner with a sharp blade that has a removable blade that I use as my grafting. So.
And you do a whip graft, then you do a diagonal cut.
Yeah. I just do diagonal cut, and it seems to work.
Yeah.
So,
That's pretty good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good.
I got the same tool a couple of years ago. There's now, they've come down in price. I think I maybe paid $40. You can now get them for maybe 20, and they look like they'd be really helpful. But besides not working unless the scion and the graft are exactly the right size, they do come with with 2 additional plates for different size scions and rootstocks. But changing the plates is really difficult and tricky, and they get dull so quickly that the cut piece of material, you end up with a hammer and a screwdriver trying to knock that out of the tool. My biggest disappointment with buying it was it's not quite heavy enough to use as a boat anchor. I wouldn't recommend them. It's just very frustrating. They look wonderful. They look like they're going to make this perfect cut where you can't possibly help getting a good match with the cambium. But
Absolutely. See, I think it's a cynical device that preys on people's insecurities, that they're
exactly.
this thing. You don't have to think about it, just you can graft.
Yeah.
But actually, if you have a good knife and you sit down and you practice for 20 minutes, you can make that cleft graft cut. It's not a hard thing. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be kind of crappy and it'll still work, some of the time anyway. So.
All right, folks, I think we're kind of petering out on questions. Does anybody have any other questions or remarks for tonight?
I have one, and if you've covered this, I had technical problem and joined late. So if you've covered this, just tell me and I'll be quiet. But does the same technique work for you on citrus? I've gotten so I'm half decent with stone fruit and apples and things, but citrus, I'm just I'm like 0 for 18 or something.
Oh, that's a great question. No one's asked that question. I forgot to bring it up. But yeah, I use the same technique for citrus, with the exception, and avocado, with the exception that with citrus, I'll wrap the entire scion with parafilm, because it's not deciduous, it's not dormant, it's transpiring, and so it'll lose its moisture. But other than that, it's the same graft. You can wrap it in masking tape, or you can wrap it in a rubber band and then parafilm over the entire thing, so it makes a mini greenhouse out of it, shaded if it's in direct sun, and that works perfectly. Yes.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. I didn't know you could do that. I thought you had to do chip grafting, bud chip, something like that.
Yeah, chip T-budding or chip grafting, those are really efficient way to make your limited scion wood go a long way. You can take 1 stick of scion wood and maybe 10 grafts out of it. A lot of times, if you're grafting your own citrus, if your own trees, you don't have to be that frugal. And I find it just, a citrus graft will be so much more eager to grow with a cleft graft, with a big piece of scion wood that's got some reserves in it, and it'll push and heal better. And the same with avocado. The thicker, the bigger, scion stick, the better it grows.
Good.
So.
Well, Jeffrey, you're going to have to report back to us on your success next year. You try the new citrus approach.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it and see if I can rescue my Washington navel that got had by a gopher, and I'm trying to save it. So maybe I'll cut some wood off of that and put it on the Meyer lemon, right? Maybe that can do that. We'll find out.
Yeah.
Let's see. And one more question from John. List the easiest to most difficult species to graft.
The easiest to graft: apples, pears, apples. I mean, probably, I don't know. That's, so, I mean, some of the stone fruit is difficult to graft. Some of the apricots can be, and then everything else falls kind of in between. Persimmon is tricky, so you have to wait for it. You generally, it's hard to wait long enough and have the stalk of the persimmon growing vigorously enough for it to be able to kickstart that scion before the scion dries out. So maybe persimmon's the most difficult. Avocado is a little bit difficult. Yeah, avocado is really dependent on the condition of the scion. Unlike most of the other things that you can graft, the scion itself has to be in kind of the initial stages of a growth flush, and if it's not, you can wait for a month or 2 months before it decides to do anything, and by that time it'll die. So yeah, we'll put avocado maybe on the most difficult, and apricot somewhere toward that end, and everything else with apples and pears super easy.
Right.
Does he agreed? What do you think, John? Is that John Valenzuela?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have to confess, I have not been having as much success with peach and nectarine grafts as I would like.
Yep.
I think I gotta wait until it's warm, but not too hot. I've done some pretty good success with tea buds, but it's one of those ones that I'm frustrated because I can do a lot of things pretty well. But it's so funny, sometimes the percentages are just not what I'd like to see them for common things even. But
I have the same problem with a peach and apricot. They're really finicky. It seems like once you cut them open this time of the year, it's the fungal and bacterially active time of the year, and you're already you're infecting that cut the minute you open it up. So I feel like things are stacked against you. And for me, I have a lot more success. I find apricot and peach are pretty easy to graft if you use a cleft graft, but graft them in early June, late May, when the new first year growth has a foot or 2 feet of growth. You take the fattest first year scion you can cut off your tree, and you graft that, use a cleft graft system just like we demonstrated, wrap it in masking tape around the wound, cover the rest of that scion with parafilm so it's entirely sealed, and suppress the growth underneath it, and those pop almost at the time. Yeah.
So you're talking about taking the new season's growth, what we would use for maybe June budding.
Yes.
Kind of half hardened off new growth that's maybe a foot or 2 feet long, that's got a firm base to it.
Yes.
And using that.
Yes.
I think I would agree with that. I've had some good success working with things that late. But just to reiterate for everybody, especially newbies here, you want to start with apples, pears, and plums, because they're like, you could just kind of get them near each other.
Someone says, you just leave a couple of the pair of the scion and the stalk in the same room together.
Yeah, they're gonna figure it out. Yeah. It's amazing. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to keep those scions in your fridge for months. Remember, we cut them in late November, December or something, January. Maybe we're still cutting them before they wake up. Yeah. But put them in the fridge. Don't let them freeze. Just a few drops of water. And I've grafted those things dormant onto midsummer, like June, July. And you look at those sticks in the fridge and you're going, I wonder if they're still alive. Huge callus at the cut ends, just like huge cauliflower amounts of like trying to root. I've had them try to flower in the bags. They will stay alive, some of them, for a very long time. And, that is apples, plums, and pears. But I've had peaches and apricots both just disintegrate within around now. Around now, I just can't hold them long in the fridge. The buds just fall off and they just disintegrate, even in a cold fridge. I
mean, sometimes your bud, if a scion gets away from you in your fridge and you don't get a chance to put it on your stock in time, if it's just starting to go, you can wrap that dormant scion that's not quite dormant anymore in parafilm and graft that, you know, like you would with that cleft graft method.
Yeah, I've done that, and then you got to make sure, like you were saying before, put a little foil or give it shade or something, because it's kind of, you know, you don't want to let the sun on that. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Anything you put parafilm on, you want to keep the sun off of it.
We do have a question about.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Sharon. Hold on just a second. So
Sorry.
Lynn is asking, what about figs and kiwi? How difficult are those to graft?
Kiwi seems straightforward to me. I don't have the hardest thing about kiwi is trying to figure out which way the buds seem like they look opposite of, you know, like it's really easy to put a kiwi scion onto your stalk upside down because they don't have a distinct directionality to them. They have a funny looking lobe. So if you take your kiwi scion out of the fridge and look at it, if you don't know which way it's supposed to go, if it wasn't cut on an angle on the top and square at the bottom, it's difficult. But aside from that, pretty easy. It's straightforward. Kiwi is nice. And the other one you're talking about?
Figs.
What was kiwi? Figs. Yeah, I haven't really had much experience grafting figs. You know, people do it all the time. Me personally, I haven't really done it. So, yeah.
All right.
I'll just mention a technique my friends who graft figs use is to avoid a lot of the sap that can get in the way from aligning the cambium and everything and wrapping it up. They will make some slashes below the area that they're going to graft onto to let that bleed out and reduce the kind of the almost like the hydraulic pressure of that sap. But
right,
it seems torturous to the tree, but that's what I've heard some people do. I've grafted figs and had success.
Yeah, I mean, avocado, walnuts, they do the same thing. They slash below the graft, or else you get too much upwelling and you flood your graft.
It can push the graft right out.
Right. So I did some walnut grafting last year and slashed it, and it seemed wrong, but worked pretty good. So.
Oh, I just want to second what John was saying. Apples are sometimes the scion look horrible. Last September, I was given some scion that had been, you know, dormant scion, so they are 8-month-old. Lots of callus. One bud was starting to show green, and because this is something really special, I went ahead and grafted them, and just within days, like 3 or 4 days, the bud that was starting to show green started popping out. And I think I had like 90% success rate. I did 15. So I didn't think I would even get one because those scion look so horrible and they look moldy and everything. But they are amazing. They just want to grow.
That's great.
Well, terrific. I think, you know, maybe we've hit the end of our questions for this evening. Is everybody good for the moment?
Yeah.